Is the European Union just a bureaucratic labyrinth, as some claim? Well, if you think so, you might be overlooking its resilience. The EU has weathered storms that could have shattered any other union. It has withstood the Greek debt crisis, which looked likely to destroy the Eurozone. It has emerged stronger from Brexit, with support for EU membership hitting record highs. And most recently, the EU has been consistently supporting Ukraine in the face of the brutal war of aggression by Russia. And yet, there is one crisis brewing under the surface that could prove much more destructive than all of those in the past, and could put the very existence of the EU at risk. I'm Jan with Prague Pulse, and this is the story of how the entire European project might be about to collapse and what Germany and France want to do about it. Before we dive in, let's set the stage. Imagine a Europe divided by the Iron Curtain, with countries under the yoke of the Kremlin yearning for freedom. Once the Iron Curtain fell, joining the EU was seen by those countries as a formal confirmation that the years of oppression were finally over. It was seen as a formal rejoining of the free world. But let's just say that the EU had a lot on its plate and was not really eager to accept new member states rapidly. For one, the fall of communism and the ensuing reunification of Germany were curveballs that the original 15 EU member states didn't really see coming that quickly. Integrating the 16 million citizens of former East Germany into the rest of Germany and consequently into the EU was a challenge in itself. That explains why the desire to open the doors of the EU to 10 more countries, together with its 74 million citizens, who are largely poorer than the EU average, was not overwhelming, to say the least. You might see the EU as a political entity, but it's mainly an economic powerhouse. And accepting new, generally poorer members means spending enormous amounts of money on their integration. Just look at the numbers. Even before the 10 countries officially became members, the EU spent 13.2 billion euros to help them transition their economies. And in just the first 2 years of their membership alone, more than a staggering 40 billion euros more were invested in their development. So, some reluctance to accept them into the fold was certainly understandable. In the end, however, negotiations were successful and the 10 countries officially became member states of the EU on May 1st, 2004. So what's this brewing crisis in the EU? You'd think that integrating new thriving members, some of which have already outgrown the original 50 member states in terms of economic performance, would make the EU stronger, right? Well, it's not that simple. You see, the EU is and always has been an enormously complex puzzle, with each piece representing a country with its own culture, government, and a unique view for the EU and its future. Some would like it to cooperate more and would be even willing to hand over control to the EU entirely, while others want to distance themselves from the EU as much as possible, while still reaping the benefits of membership. Naturally, the more member states the EU has, the more opinions there are, and so the more difficult it is to govern and develop the EU further. Enter the Lisbon Treaty of 2009, which aimed to streamline decision-making within the EU and prevent stagnation. This was to be achieved by, for instance, using majority voting much more at the expense of unanimous voting, where every single member state would have to agree before a decision is formally taken. Well, but here's the catch. To pass a new treaty that scraps unanimous voting, you need, yes, you guessed it, unanimous support. So naturally, negotiating the treaty became a nightmare, which lasted several long years. And if you're curious about the last holdout, former president of Czechia Václav Klaus, we've got a video just for you. In the end, after a long battle, the Lisbon Treaty got approved. And because of how difficult it had been to agree, no one was really in a rush to go back to the drawing board anytime soon. So is the Lisbon Treaty a win-win for everyone? Well, on the surface, it may seem so. While it does expand the powers of the EU in some respects, the member states still dominate, especially in key areas such as foreign policy or security, where unanimous approval is still needed. That means that the more Eurosceptic countries can still assert their will if they wish to do so. A period of relative calm set in, with both the Euro-optimistic and the more pessimistic camps having something to show to their voters at home. However, this tranquility came to a screeching halt on February 24, 2022. When the brutal and unprovoked invasion of Ukraine by Russia started, it was clear that the world, together with the EU, needed to change rapidly. Suddenly, the certainties upon which the European security system had been built were gone. At the same time, the role the EU plays has changed dramatically, not only through the amounts of humanitarian, financial and military aid it provides to Ukraine. The EU's relationship to its neighbors has transformed as well. Now, more than ever, countries like Ukraine or Moldova see the EU as a shield for their national security and a guarantee of their survival. But be warned, expanding the EU without caution could unravel the entire European project. So what's the catch? Well, the EU simply isn't ready for more members, even if it's a strategic necessity. Imagine a boardroom where everyone has a veto. Progress becomes a pipe dream. Take Hungary, for example, which currently holds a veto over a €500 million aid package to Ukraine. And they can do this while still being a net recipient of EU funds themselves. Thus, progress is stifled and would be even more so after a potential EU enlargement. Stuck in this deadlock, France and Germany have stepped up. They've assembled experts to chart a way forward for the EU. Their influence is so significant that their recommendations could very well shape the EU's destiny and influence its survival. So what's their game plan? Firstly, they're doubling down on democracy and the rule of law by making sure that only countries who respect these fundamental values can become and remain EU members. Currently, being democratic and respecting the rule of law is one of the preconditions to become an EU member. There is a problem though. The conditions only apply before a country joins the EU. Before accepting a new member, the EU can quite easily force a change in behavior by simply denying membership. However, once a country has joined, there is very little the EU can do if it violates fundamental EU values. As an example, the Polish ruling party, the PiS, has come under heavy criticism for seriously weakening the independence of the country's judiciary and the media. Its strict rules on abortions are also being scrutinized right now by the EU, but it still remains a full EU member with all the benefits. The Franco-German reform aims to change this by strictly conditioning the distribution of EU money upon the country's respect for the rule of law. Currently, the Commission can only withhold money if it can prove that a potential rule of law violation directly threatens the EU budget. Under the new proposal, this condition would be scrapped, and it would be way easier to withhold funding once a country violates rule of law principles. Because countries are often heavily reliant on EU funds, this could be the game changer the EU needs. Second, imagine a classroom where one disruptive student can halt the entire lesson. Well, that's basically the EU right now. While on paper it does already have some tools to deal with disruptive member states, for example by suspending its voting rights or the right to the rotating presidency in the Council of the EU, that can easily be blocked because a unanimous vote of all the other members is needed. In effect, one friend is everything a member state needs to get away with rule of law violations today. The Franco-German proposal aims to change that. A majority vote would be enough to suspend some rights of a country that breaches EU values. This would make it harder for countries to back each other up and block sanctions. Third, in a larger EU, the European Commission, essentially an EU government, should be made smaller. Currently, each member state has a commissioner, who is essentially a minister of the EU. This would not be sustainable in a larger EU though. The number of portfolios is not infinite, and the more commissioners there are, the more inconsequential their responsibilities. This problem would get even bigger after a future enlargement, if the current system of one commissioner per member state were to be maintained. You know, too many cooks just spoil the broth. Actually, the Lisbon Treaty stipulates in its Article 17.5 that the number of commissioners should be lower, and that commissioners should rotate for that very reason. However, the member states have been unable and unwilling to agree on the rotating system's specifics, and so it has been largely ignored until today. Deciding to finally use it would not be anything revolutionary. It's something that the member states themselves have already agreed on in principle. If the rotating system is impossible to agree on, however, the Franco-German proposal offers a workaround: a lead and deputy commissioner system, switching roles halfway through the term. The total number of portfolios would thus be smaller, but all member states would be represented at all times. Fourth, the EU should shift to majority voting wherever possible. Because nothing is really simple about the EU even today, it currently uses a system called qualified majority voting for many of its decisions. In such a vote, a motion has to gain the support of 55% of the total number of member states, comprising at least 65% of EU's total population. This system has been designed to protect the interests of smaller member states while also making progress more likely because it has replaced unanimous voting in some areas. The problem is that in key areas, which are arguably becoming more important than ever before, such as security or foreign policy, unanimity still persists. It will be even more difficult to reach an agreement in those areas with an expanded EU in the future. So, the Franco-German proposal is to abolish unanimity wherever possible, while also increasing the thresholds needed for qualified majority voting to pass. That would hopefully make the EU more agile and responsive to crises. And finally, Germany and France recognize that some level of division and differentiation may be needed for the EU to survive. To prevent countries blackmailing each other, it should be possible for some member states to progress further in integration than others. Today, all members have an obligation to progress to an ever closer union all the time. All member states, except for Denmark, which has negotiated an opt-out, for instance, need to one day switch to the euro as their national currency. What the reforms suggest is to allow different levels of integration and enshrine them in the treaties. Essentially, this would create several versions of the EU, with member states being able to choose freely which areas to cooperate on and where not to, while also committing not to block other member states who wish to integrate deeper in those areas. The non-negotiable baseline, well, that will be democracy and the rule of law. So what might actually bring the EU close to implosion and collapse, you might ask? Ironically, it might be its own inability to adapt. These Franco-German proposals are just the starting point. For them to become reality, they'll need to navigate the complex maze that is the EU, a maze that thrives on debate but is also increasingly held hostage by its own members. And they would need to be agreed on unanimously, which, as we explained, is quite an ordeal. The road to reform is long and fraught, but it may be the only way forward for the EU if it is to expand and survive.